Once all the gods met for a conference. All the goddesses met for a conference. And the mighty gods talked about why Baldr was having bad dreams. Odin stood up, that All-Father of gods, and he saddled his horse Sleipnir. Then he rode down to Hell, till he saw the dog of Hell. The dog had a bloody chest and barked a long time as Odin passed. Odin rode on. The stones of the road rattled till he came to the high house of Hell. Then Odin rode east of the door to Hell, and there he found the grave of a witch. And then the battle god spoke a spell till her corpse was forced to rise and spoke. Who is this man, unknown to me, who has brought me back to loathsome life? I was buried in the snow, pelted by rain, drowned in dew. I was dead a long time. Odin said, I am the road tamer, son of corpse tamer. Tell me news from hell, and I'll tell you news from above. Whose arrival are these benches, draped with straw for? Why is the floor all covered in gold? The witch said, the mead is brewed for Baldr's arrival. A shield is placed over the fresh brew. All the gods are in suspense. I was forced to speak. Now I return to silence. Odin said, don't go silent, witch. I want to ask you more, till I understand everything, and I want to know more. Who will be the killer of my son Baldr? Who will steal the life of Odin's son? The witch said, Hoth will bear. The long spear will kill him. He will be the killer of your son Baldr. He will steal the life of Odin's son. I was forced to speak. Now I return to silence. Odin said, don't go silent, witch. I want to ask you more, till I understand everything, and I want to know more. Who will avenge Hoth's crime? Who will put Baldr's killer on the funeral pyre? The witch said, in halls to the west, Rhine will give birth to your son Vali, and he will avenge Baldr. When he is only 1 night old, he will neither comb his hair nor wash his hands till he puts Baldr's killer on the funeral pyre. I was forced to speak. Now I return to silence. Odin said, don't go silent, witch. I want to ask you more, till I understand everything, and I want to know more. Who are the women who weep in longing, who throw their necklaces up in the sky? The witch said, you are not road tamer, like I thought you were. No, You are Odin, the aged god. You are neither a witch nor a wise woman. Odin said, "No, you are the mother of 3 monsters." The witch said, "Ride home, Odin. Feel triumphant for now. But you will come for a second visit when Loki breaks free from his chains and Ragnarok comes to end everything." Welcome back to the Gnostic Informant, and you are about to attain true gnosis. And I'm with John White from Ford. Go and subscribe if you haven't yet. It is one of the treasures of information about Norse mythology, Proto-Indo-European mythology, and yeah, it's a really good resource. I watch your videos all the time. Really enjoy it. Thanks for coming on.
Thanks, Phil. Good to be here again.
Yeah, and Baldr's Dreams is a interesting book. It's the one the version I got is this one right here in English from Jackson Crawford. Um, I'm not sure what you think about this version compared to what it says in the other languages, but let's get into that. And yeah, what is this book about, and where does it come from? How old is it? All that stuff.
Right, so the book you've just lifted up is called the Poetic Edda. It's based on a number of manuscripts we found dated to the late 13th century, and it was probably compiled by some Christian monks in Iceland. And now, in the end of the 13th century, Iceland had been Christian for about 300 years. So, what has happened is they're writing these stories down as a record of not just the stories being told, but also the poetry, because the poetry at the time was considered amazing. That was a real piece of beauty. And there's another Christian in Iceland, Snorri Sturluson, who then wrote an accompanying book, the Prose Edda, and he wrote that slightly before that. And so what you have is the greatest hits of poems in that book. And the poem you've talked about, Baldr's Dream, or Baldr's Drumur, as it's called, is one of the stories in there about the son of Odin, or one of Odin's many sons, Baldr, who had a dream that he was going to die. So at the start of this show, you've read the poem of his dream, and yeah, we can talk about it, because the whole story of Baldr is almost like a road through all Norse mythology. It touches many other stories, and it lays the groundwork for them to understand why they're there.
Yeah, and a lot of times you hear about. Well, first let's get into the meaning of this. So Odin, he is taking a trip down to hell, if I'm not
He's been
mistaken.
asked to by his wife Frigg. So basically, Baldr has gone to all the gods and said, "I've had this bad dream. I'm going to die." And Frigg, his mum, says to Odin, his dad, "You've got to do something. Is it true?" And that's where the poem goes in. So yes, so that's where Odin then goes to hell.
And so he meets this witch, but the witch is dead, right?
Yes.
She's dead. So what is the reason why he wakes this he he resurrects this witch?
Yes. The
What's
spell.
the
Yes.
reason behind this?
Right. So he also did this in the Volaspor, which is the beginning of the gods and end of the world myth. So he goes and raises a seeress from the dead, and it's because these seeresses, these witches, as you call them, they can prophesize the future.
Interesting.
And so, if he wants to know, is what Baldr is telling us the truth? Is that the future? And so that's why he's doing that. And actually, if the Hovermall, which we touched on briefly last time we spoke, I think he talks about acquiring the runes, and the 12th spell he acquires from hanging from the tree for 9 nights is actually raising someone from the dead.
Wow.
And he sort of alludes to that.
And so this witch basically tells him, yeah, he's going to die. And he also asks her, she keeps trying to go back to hell, and he keeps
She
saying,
does want
"Oh,"
to talk to him. Yeah, she
yeah,
says, I
she's
don't
like,
want to
"I'm
do it.
getting out of here." And he's like, "No, no, 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 come back, come back." It's like 3 times he does this.
Yeah.
And he's basically asking her about,
Who does it?
who's
Yeah.
gonna be the killer, who's gonna avenge Baldr,
That's
and
it.
she keeps telling him all this stuff. And so it's pretty interesting. It reminds me, and then the last part that I really thought was interesting was at the end, where she says, "The ride home, Odin, feel triumphant now, but you will come for a second visit when Loki breaks free from his chains and Ragnarok comes to an end everything." And right away, in my mind, went to Revelation, where it talks about Satan is going to be awakened from his chains for after the 1,000-year reign is over, where he's going to come back and trick the world at the end of times. What do you think about that? Do you think there is a connection there, or what do you think about
Um, there are similarities between stories, and what we've got to be careful of is working out whether those similarities are there because they've evolved from the same theme, or the same story many years before, or whether they're just coincidental. And this may be coincidental because, well, it may not. There may be influence there from the people writing the poem, because the actual story of Baldr is actually many hundreds, if not thousands, of years older than the Poetic Edda alludes to, and we can come to that. And I can tell you the original story of Baldr and Holther. And so, for people who don't know, Holther is the person who's going to kill Baldr, and that's what the seeress says in her dream. It says like Holther is going to be the killer of Baldr, and that's their brothers. And Holther is blind, and then there's going to be a venge from Vali. Well, the Poetic Edda actually says it's Odin's going to have another son with a giantess called Rinda, and that son isn't called V in the poem, like on the manuscript, but we believe that's Vili or Valley. And Vali's going to have revenge. So he's laid that plot. But yeah, the end bit in terms of the bonding, that is a piece of horrific torture to Loki, that bonds him, but he's actually initially bonded in his son's entrails. So they kill Loki's son in front of Loki, uses his guts to bind him, and those guts turn into chains.
Wow, that's crazy right there. And so the Baldr, who is the son of the All-Father. I hear this all the time from people who try to compare Baldr to Jesus.
Yes.
What do you think about that part?
So yeah, that's for another reason. So the person who originally started that was a chap called Sophus Bugger, and he was the chap who also wrote about Odin hanging being a sort of an analogue of the gospel crucifixion myth. Now, he says that because Baldr is often described as a good god, a god everybody loves, and a shining light. And what that means in Norse poetry, really, if someone's described as bright or white, that's reflecting their beauty. It isn't reflecting any particular color of their skin or what they look like, their complexion. So they talk about the Yggdrasil being white, being beautiful. It's just a term for that. So because he's given this sort of description that could mean shining light and white, and he's good and he's loved so much, and he is the son of the chief god, much like Jesus is the son of God. You can see there's lots of parallels there that would make you think, oh, yeah, Baldr could well be an analog for Jesus. But bear in mind that Christ wasn't passive in his life. He was always preaching, and he didn't really live a good life, where Baldr didn't preach or anything. He's quite passive, and he lived a very, very good life. And Christ knew he was going to be sacrificed. Baldr had no idea. It almost looks like an accident. It isn't an accident, but he sort of looks like that. And his killer, or Loki. So whilst we say Hother kills Baldr, it's actually Loki that puts all the pieces in place
Right.
and pushes Hother down the path.
Can you tell us what happens with this? Can you tell them so they know?
Yeah, I'll tell the story. So, but the point there was that because Loki had never shown any ill towards Baldr before that point, where Judas knew he was going to kill, going to betray Jesus, and that's going to happen. So the actual key elements of the story and are not like Jesus' story at all. It's just the easiest catching the name. So the actual story of Baldr. So when Odin comes back and tells Frigg, "Oh, Baldr's going to die," Frigg makes everything in the world promise not to hurt Baldr. So, from the inanimate and animate objects, I think Snorri says in the Prose Edda. So, in the Prose Edda, in Gylfaginning, in I think it's 49 onwards, it tells this story. And so she makes sure all the metal and wood and rocks of the world won't hurt Baldr, but she makes sure all the people in the world say they won't hurt Baldr. And they all agree, but there's one plant Frigg talks to or sees it, which is mistletoe. And mistletoe is seen as a young plant to her. So it's described in the story as mistletoe is too young to make a promise. So that doesn't promise to hurt Baldr because he doesn't consider it an issue. And then what happens is that one day, time passes and Loki walks into a meeting of the gods and they're all throwing things at Baldr. And I was thinking, why are you all throwing things at Baldr? This is odd, and everybody's having a laugh and a good time, and he feels a bit, you could say, jealous or out of place. He's Loki. He's feeling a bit. Why is everybody paying attention to Baldr? So he disguises himself as a woman and goes up to Frigg and says, "What's going on here?" And Frigg says, "Oh, Baldr's immune from everything, so the gods are just playing with him. We're all having fun trying to kill him. But there is one thing that can hurt him." Oh, and Loki in disguise says, "What's that?" And she goes, "It's mistletoe. He didn't make a promise to mistletoe not to hurt him because it was too young." And with that, Loki disappears. And actually, I forget, but that Frigg actually tells Loki that mistletoe is found west of Valhalla, so in a really strange place and quite a long way away. So Loki disappears, gets the mistletoe, and comes back to this meeting where everybody's throwing things, and he creates a spear or a branch out of this mistletoe and goes to Hother. Now Hother isn't taking part, and he goes, "Why aren't you taking part, Hother?" And he says, "I'm blind, so I can't see where Baldr is. And also I haven't got a weapon." And Loki says, "Well, here, have this weapon and throw it this way." So Hother takes this mistletoe branch off Loki and throws it at Baldr, and it pierces him, goes straight through him. It's a mortal wound. Baldr falls to the ground dead, and the gods are just stunned silent. They, everybody is so
it's
sad.
the story of an accident, right?
Sorry?
It's an accident?
Well, no, it's not an accident because Loki knew mistletoe hurts Baldr. Hother didn't know it was mistletoe. So from Hother's point of view, complete accident.
Right.
But Loki made it happen. And this is really interesting. So this is where you start understanding, well, there's got to be more to the story than this. Yeah, and there is a lot more. But from that point, why is there a blind god there, Hother? That doesn't make sense. Odin is half blind. It doesn't make normal storytelling sense for a half blind god to have a blind son. You don't normally see that in storytelling. You don't normally see this action where a sort of someone else forces someone else to kill someone like that. Not in a mythology. That seems really sneaky way of doing things. But also mistletoe, because mistletoe doesn't grow in Iceland. In fact, mistletoe hardly grows in Scandinavia. It isn't a plant that people would have been familiar with. So where did that come from? And then you can start asking questions like, where does that come from? And we can talk about that in a bit when we finish talking about this Norse story, because there is actually another story of Baldr and Hother written by Saxo Grammaticus in his book, The History of the Danes, written about the same time as the Prose Edda. So there's this Danish historian who's writing about the same story, but from what he's hearing, and it's quite a different story. But there are some similarities and some differences. And then if we look at these two stories, we'll be able to bring up what probably is the very original story about Baldr and Hother.
So
all that's to come. So carry on watching.
Yeah, right. So that's fascinating. So now, does Baldr actually get resurrected? Is this something?
Right. So that again, we see that. So what happens is obviously Frigg is very upset that Baldr's died, Obviously, it's her son, and everybody loves her, and he's a shining beacon, beautiful. And she wants him back, so she gets her son, or she says, "Who would ride to hell to ask hell if we can get Baldr back to the living?" And it's Hermothr, who is another one of Odin's sons, says, "I'll do that." And Odin gives Hermothr the Sleipnir, who's his 8-legged horse, and says, "Ride off to hell." And so off he goes. And while he's doing that, all the gods start arranging the funeral. And there's a whole heap of funeral story going on here, which adds a lot more issues to make you think, actually, this story isn't original. There's obviously an older story that has been sort of changed or mutated or grown.
Right.
And we can tell. And it does seem odd that Odin's son's riding off to hell whilst they're having a funeral for his other son. Surely his son would have stayed, but these things happen, and they're happening for a reason. So in the funeral, what happens is Baldr has the largest ship ever known, and so they create a pyre on that ship. But the ship is currently on land, so it has to be pushed into the sea, and the gods can't push it into the sea. So they invite a giantess along to push the ship into the sea. And she turns up on a wolf with snakes for reins, as most giantesses do, which is a thing for trolls. Often you normally see happen in Norse mythology. So she rides up and she gets off the wolf. The wolf's being a bit playful, so Odin tells people to look after, like some berserkers, look after that wolf, and they actually kill the wolf. And there's Thor as well, who hates giants, who wants to kill her. And everybody said, "Don't kill her, Thor. Let her push the boat into the sea so we can then light the pyre." And so the boat gets pushed into the sea, and then onto the boat walks Nana. And Nana is Baldr's wife. And when Nana sees Baldr's body on the pyre ready to be burnt, her heart breaks and she dies. And then she's put on the pyre next to Baldr. And then the pyre is lit, and things start to burn. And then Thor goes up to the pyre, and he wants to consecrate it. And as he's about to consecrate it, a dwarf called Lit runs past Thor, and Thor accidentally kicks him into the fire, and he burns to death.
Wow.
And so we can explain that in a minute too. And then what happens then is Odin whispers something to Baldr at this point, which is another mystery of Old Norse mythology, and he places a golden arm ring on Baldr's chest called the Dropnir, and Dropnir is magical. Every 9 nights, it replicates 8 similar rings without magical properties, all the same weight and size, made of gold. So it's a very magical ring. So he puts it on Baldr's chest, and that gets burnt and alive. And so that is the basic premise of the funeral. So it's a bit chaotic.
Yeah. Well, let me ask you this: when Odin says to the witch, "Who are the women who weep in longing, who throw their necklaces up in the sky?" She doesn't really answer that.
No.
Is there an answer to this? What does he mean by that?
No. So there is a necklace known held by the goddess that is a sort of a very beautiful necklace. So it may be some sort of reference to that, and the weeping may be a reference to what will happen later on in the story. But yes, it doesn't. Nothing's really said about that, as is nothing is said about Loki escaping from his chains, which is really odd as well. It makes you think, well, why aren't you paying attention to that? Because that's a really significant thing that's going to happen then. So yeah, I don't get that.
Well, what it made me think of is that there's the tradition in the ancient Sumerian and Assyrian with Tammuz or Dumuzi, when he was down in the underworld, the women would weep for him.
Exactly, and that is actually an analog that is spotted by, I think it's Lieberman in his book Prayer and Laughter. He says it could be that Baldr has some Eastern influence into him, and we can talk about that because Baldr is also associated with people like Osiris. That's so because we haven't really explained. Baldr is a god, but we haven't really said what is he a god of. Okay,
He seems to
and
be he seems to be the sort of Norse version of this sort of I don't wanna say dying and rising god, but it sort of is actually. Is that
well, he's a dying god. He didn't. So
dying
this
god?
is a dying god story because he
But
doesn't.
what do you think? It's
When he does
agricultural?
rise,
Do you think it's
but
agricultural?
I think he's.
You think it's agricultural?
Yeah, so definitely a strong agricultural influence.
Right.
The weeping is like a metaphor for rain, and he's a bright god, which is like sun. So actually, he's more of a sky god, not necessarily a sky father figure, but definitely a
Right.
sky god, and that is interesting. So we'll get to that in a bit later because that explains a number of other things that are going on.
Yeah.
Um,
Okay.
okay,
Yeah. That's interesting too. I wanna also say something about Loki real quick, and
mhm.
then we can sort of scale back and fill in all the blanks because when she says to Odin that Loki will break free from his chains, he doesn't really realize he's the one who puts him in chains later on. He didn't. This didn't happen yet. So
Exactly,
she's predicting his own actions, and he follows through with it. He
exactly.
actually chains Loki up. So wouldn't that mean that she's going to be correct and that Loki is going to become free from his? She's right about everything else. Why
Yep,
would she
she
be right?
is. She's prophesizing. Yeah, absolutely. She's spot on, and that's odd that Odin doesn't really take that with any more significance because it
Right.
should click there. So it may be, yeah. Just mythology is odd. So in Old Norse mythology, you have the creation and the end, but everything else seems to happen on the same day. So there is no sort of canonical timeline. Things are all over the place. So
Yeah.
perhaps he hasn't done the first few verses of the Volatile yet, where he's gone and raised a Sirius who's told him about Ragnarok. So if he doesn't know about Ragnarok, then when she's alluding to Ragnarok happening, perhaps he doesn't know that yet. So
Right.
therefore, he hasn't clicked what's really going on.
And so, how does he actually get Loki to be chained up? What does he do there?
Right, so that's jumping well ahead of the story. So, which we can do. So when everybody realizes that it was Loki, they have to go and catch him. There's a whole story about how he's caught, which is interesting, which we can talk about. But when he is caught, they then pin him down by some boulders, take his son to him, and in the it might be the Gylfaginning, that a couple of sons are brought to him. Actually, there's Narfi, but they also say they brought Vali to him. Now, but Vali is Odin's son. So it looks like there's some corruption in the text. He's got some names confused. Um, and Baldr has other sons' names you see in other stories as well. But basically, at the end of the day, Narfi is killed. His guts are used to tie Loki to these rocks that are sort of putting him down, and those guts turn to chains. And then a snake, this is quite interesting, a snake is killed or no, isn't a snake is held above Loki's head, and it drips poison onto Loki's face. And so Loki's wife has to stay there with him, catching the poison so it doesn't drip on his face. However, when her bowl fills up and she has to empty that poison, a drip will land on his face. That will cause him immense pain, and he will shake. And when he shakes, that is what causes earthquakes, or so the old Norse myth goes. So
Right.
that's how he ends up in chains when the gods eventually catch him. But I say you've jumped several.
Yeah. Well, I just wanted to clear that up because it mentions it in the prophecy.
Hmm,
So even though I'm jumping far ahead, I mean, she is
you
too.
should know about
Basically,
it.
think about it. She's jumping ahead too. She's
Yeah, she
saying
knows
that
it.
you're gonna lock him in chains, but he's gonna escape, and
Hmm.
he's like, whatever. See you later.
Yeah, exactly. Because he obviously doesn't realise she's inferring that the end of the world is happening at that point. He hasn't quite got that. Because when I first heard this, I thought, well, perhaps that CRS is the same CRS that he used to understand at the start of the Volaspel that he's going to die, at Ragnarok. But it isn't. They're different. They've got different names. Although no one's really sure because the CRS isn't really attested to in Volospol. But I believe that she is the Ceres that Odin kills with a spear at the very start of Norse mythology. That creates the war between the Aesir and the Vanir, and causes hate with the Jotuns. There's a whole heap of things going on.
Right. And
That's a whole different
this is sort of
episode.
and this was sort of like another version of the Titans and Olympians. in Norse
Yeah, there's this beginning myth. So people, it sort of irks me a bit that people get these things because there's most mythologists have a beginning myth and a creation myth. So the beginning myth is how the cosmos is created and the world is set in order. Then the creation myth is how man is created and the things that happen. And you very often see them together in mythology, but they are separate myths, and we must be careful to sort of separate them to understand what's going on in each one. So yes, certainly, this is part of the beginning myth to set the landscape for the rest of the mythology.
And so this is a short story. I didn't want to spend too much time on it, and I kind of wanted to make this a short video, sort of. I mean, this is what else? Any surrounding?
Yes. So yeah, there's a whole, as I say, there's a whole heap of stuff going on. So quickly, then Lit, who get kicked into fire, is probably a servant of Baldr, and it is thought that he's kicked into the fire almost deliberately because servants are not needed if their master is dead. When they realize Loki is the perpetrator, as a person who's caused this, he goes into hide and turns into a salmon and hides in a river. The gods try and find him, and Kvasir, we've sort of mentioned about briefly, is the god who's made from the spittle of giants, and that spittle was created at the end of the war when all the gods spat in a jar together to make peace, which is a sort of a ritual. A man was made out of that who's Kvasir, and he was the most intelligent man in the world. He helps the gods find Loki by seeing a fishing net in Loki's room and said, "Oh, he must have turned into a fish." They try and fish him out, and the salmon escapes the net, and Thor catches the salmon by the tail, holds him hard, and that's why salmons have tapered tails. So that's another bit of Old Norse mythology. As they put him there. But why mistletoe is the big one? Yeah, and who is Baldr and Hothor, and why is Hothor blind? Well, there is another story in, say, the Danish mythology that basically has Baldr and Hothor in it. Baldr sees Nanna, who's his wife in the Old Norse one, but sees Nanna bathing in this Danish one and falls in love with her. But her father is approached by Hothor saying he wants to marry Nanna, and so his father says, "Well, I can't give Nanna to you, Hothor, because Baldr's asked. Baldr is a really good god, but Nanna actually fancies Hothor. So what happens? And also Baldr is invulnerable." Yeah, invulnerable in this story as well, but he's told there is a sword that can kill him. It's called Mimin's sword, and Mimin is a satyr in this story. So Hothor attacks Baldr, defeats him, but doesn't kill him, and then he goes off. And whilst he goes off, Baldr then goes to the Nanna's father and attacks him, and wins, and attacks Hothor again and wins that. And then there's one final battle, and Baldr beats Hothor at that. And then that night, Hothor tries to find Baldr because he's got this sword, and he comes across some of Baldr's servants finding out that it is actually snake poison in Baldr's food that makes him strong and invulnerable, which is quite interesting. Yeah, it might be a reflex of the snake poison hitting Loki. I don't know. But then he follows his servants, finds Baldr, stabs him with a sword in his side, and 3 days later, Baldr dies. And they get revenge through Odin's son. Odin has a son with Vinda, the same names, but that son's called Boss, and yes, and it carries on. And so we see these stories. So Baldr's killed by a sword in the Danish one, and a plant in the old Icelandic one. And what you see is that in mythology, rarely does a sword get turned into a plant. So the sword story isn't probably the original one. The plant story, the mistletoe, is probably the original one, but mistletoes aren't there, and it looks like there's a corruption of an old English word around a plant or reed that has gone to Iceland and turned into mistletoe.
Wow!
And reeds are quite often used in mythology as a plant to kill people, as a sacred plant. And so, to cut a long story short, it seems like the very original story, and give credit to Anatoly Lieberman in his Prayer and Laughter book, which, if you like Norse mythology, this is an exceptionally good book worth reading.
It's a big one too.
It might be hard to get because it's published in Moscow, and at the moment, that's probably not a great place to order books from. But at the end of the story, so Lehman basically says is what's actually happening here is Baldr was actually a sky god, a god of agriculture and sun, and he was like a shining light. Baldr means shining light. Hothor is probably his opposite, his nemesis, and a god of the underworld, and that's why he's blind. He's anti-light. He doesn't need to see, and so you have these two gods fighting over Nanna. And what basically happens is that Nanna is probably liking Hothor. Nanna is probably liking Baldr. So Hothor comes along and kills Baldr with a reed, because that is a pretty typical mythological thing. We see it in other myths. And Baldr goes to the underworld, where he's then cursed to look after crops forever from the underworld. Therefore, he changes rank. So that is what is probably the original myth of Baldr and Hothor.
That's so strange that you mentioned that he's kind of a version of Osiris, because in Osiris mythology, when Osiris becomes the king of the underworld, he is the Egyptians actually felt that every year when the crops would rise and the corn would grow,
Exactly.
it was Osiris that was behind all this, and that it was actually his erection was the corn growing, the golden phallus of Osiris.
Exactly. So we do think there's links and influence there.
Yeah, you could definitely. It's just one of those things that you could just
with the weeping and the links to the Near East with that. Yeah, there's some commonality there.
With Tammuz, Osiris, Attis.
Yep, they've all been linked. And you got Aphrodite with her myrtle tree. Yeah, you got this link with plants and sacredness. Yeah,
it's fascinating. And like I said, when I read this myth, as short as it was very profound to me, because it rang like all the other mysteries of the ancient world. The sort of connection between the underworld and the above world, the above and below, the savior going down into the underworld where nobody returns, and sort of making a how do I say this? Basically doing a heroic deed to sort of change the fate.
And, we didn't talk about the deed. So the deed to get Baldr back. So say her mother went to hell. Yeah, because he ran off. They had the funeral. I forgot to. So he went to hell. Said to hell, "Can we get Baldr back?" She said, "Yes, you can take Baldr back. You have to prove one thing, that he's loved by everyone. So if everyone and everything in the world weeps for Baldr, he can come back alive." And everybody, and all the gods went all around the world, got everybody to weep, apart from one giant, whose name translates to thanks. And there may be something in that, and that giant didn't. And people, and it's believed that giant was probably Loki in disguise. He said, "I will never weep for Baldr. He's never done anything for me in his life or his death," and so Baldr doesn't return.
Wow, and it reminds me of, like we see in all these other myths, like Tammuz or Persephone, where they're gonna get her out, but then something happens. Oh, she took a bite of the pomegranate, so therefore she can come back, but only for a certain time of the year. So you can see how it reflects on the agriculture of the world. But since we're in the north, there's probably a different meaning behind it. There's different weather, it's cold.
All things have changed.
Things are different, right? So they have a different way of telling the story based on their climate, based on their history, based on whatever they want to do.
Exactly. I mean, that short poem of probably 8 stanzas or 10 stanzas, it's not very long, that probably has created more literature in Old Norse than pretty much any other stanza, apart from that sort of Havmorn and Volaspor.
I'm not surprised. As soon as I read it, I texted you right away. I was like, we got to do a video on this.
As I say, we could talk about it a lot longer, because as I say, there's the whole story of what happens at the funeral and after, and all the other stories that links to and before, and all the analogies. But yeah, it's a great.
There's a lot we can get into. I think we should definitely do more like this, more little quick half an hour takes on certain parts of the Prose Edda and the Poetic Edda. What is there anything else that we're missing as far as getting an overview on this?
I think that's I have jumped about a lot, and we have missed tons. I mean,
there's a lot. There's a lot.
There's a lot, but they're the core things. I mean, what in principle for people to understand is that yes, there's the Old Norse version, but we're really lucky to have this other version that allows us to compare, and then using that analysis create a very original version that is probably 1,000 years old, not like sort of 1,000 years older. So maybe 2,500 years old.
Wow.
So that's which is what we've done with the original. So that's why Baldr and Hothor are opposites, sort of thing, and it makes you understand why he's blind. But yeah, they're the key aspects. And you say that the motifs are going to hell, you understand, and there's all these little mini stories in the funeral that link to all the other myths. So providing we understand all that, it's just, Snorri was an exceptionally good storyteller, although it's hard to understand his because there's not a good translation of the Prose Edda, really.
Right.
The Poetic Edda, there's some good versions. The one you said with Jackson Crawford, it's contemporary, easy to understand. But I think that's a good starter for 10. Yeah,
absolutely. And people definitely leave some comments so we can get some dialogue going for the next one, and we can figure out where we want to go next.
Just name any particular story in Old Norse you want to know more about, and we can dive into that. And I can do sort of some of the stuff that perhaps people don't realise, because people don't realise maybe the original story of Baldr and Hothor, and how Hothor was probably a god of the underworld and blind for that reason, being an anti-Baldr god.
Yeah, it's interesting how it plays out like that, and he, it's fascinating. His own brother by accident because of Loki's masterminding. You know what I mean? It's just
and that's quite interesting, because Loki, it could be, if you consider Hothor, it's probably an underworld god, and Loki is very similar. They're both chthonic sort of gods, and so those stories have probably overlapped. One story, Loki probably killed Baldr. In other stories, it's Hothor, and these have merged, and that's why Snorri has created this story with Loki then influencing Hothor to kill Baldr. And that's how these sort of things sort of develop.
That makes sense. And so, everybody go and subscribe to Krakenford if you haven't yet. And, like I always say, you have just attained true gnosis.
You have just attained true gnosis. The demiurge has no power over you.